The N.W.T. Minister of Finance, Wawzonek, and Deputy Minister Bill MacKay want to better prioritize Indigenous applicants in the hiring process. A major difference from the last framework is it gives equal priority to Indigenous applications, regardless if they're from the N.W.T. or not. It will remove existing priority groups known as P1s and P2s, which prioritized only N.W.T.-born Indigenous residents and longtime residents who are not Indigenous. Wawzonek says she's heard that the boundaries of the N.W.T. and the current model doesn't necessarily reflect people's cultural ties.
People who may be N.W.T, but see themselves as Inuit and wonder why they would not qualify currently under our Affirmative Action Policy, or Métis, but not members of a recognized group in the Northwest Territories, and again, born and raised here, but don't see themselves as qualifying as the quote-unquote P2 or an Indigenous Northerners.
As of March this year, Indigenous representation in the territorial public service had hit 28.7%. According to data going back to the year 2000, that's a record low. For 2023, the non-Indigenous unemployment rate in the N.W.T. was 1.3%, while the rate for Indigenous residents was 14%. Minister Wawzonek hopes the new Indigenous Employment Policy will help the government's workforce more closely align with the population it serves, which is nearly 50% Indigenous. She says it focuses exclusively on Indigenous recruitment and career development. The new policy will require annual reporting on workforce demographics to measure progress and ensure it's implemented consistently across departments. A new mentorship program for Indigenous persons will also be rolling out this year. The current plan will end at the end of March 2025, and then the new policy will come into effect. Jocelyn Chappelle, CBC News, Yellowknife.
For more on the new policy, we're joined by N.W.T. Finance Minister Wawzonek. Welcome, Minister.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, so we saw some of those statistics in Jocelyn's story that we're at about 30%, and that's been kind of a static statistic.
That's right.
Of Indigenous employment, not where the GNWT wants to be.
That's right.
And that's with these affirmative action policies that are long-standing. So how will this new policy help boost those numbers?
Well, the new policy is part of a much bigger action plan, which is the Indigenous Recruitment and Retention Framework. Doing affirmative action on its own, treating it like that's going to be a silver bullet, simply hasn't worked, and that's been borne out not only in our jurisdiction, other jurisdictions as well. But we are, I think, the only one left in Canada that's trying to approach the problem this way. So we have a 35-year-old policy that simply we're finding isn't working. So what we're trying to do now is refocus. And, I think they had the labor market statistics up there showing that amongst non-Indigenous Northerners, unemployment rate of 1%. But amongst Indigenous Northerners, obviously, this is a group we need to focus on. So we're refocusing the policy to look exclusively at Indigenous Canadians, which is a group that is obviously underrepresented in the public service, and yet a population in the Northwest Territories that has a large number of Indigenous people. So focusing exclusively on that, which makes it, again, focused, makes it simpler, makes it clearer, makes it easier to apply. And one other big part about it is that it actually now aligns better with the kind of data that we have from Statistics Canada. So being a Northern Indigenous person isn't something that Statistics Canada gathers data on. So we aren't even in a position to be gathering data to truly understand just how representative or not this policy or the public service has been. So what we're doing now by making this change is actually aligning with that data. We can do a better job of monitoring, better job of reporting, and ultimately that should help us have a better job of success.
Okay. I want to go back to, I understand it's data-based and what Statistics Canada has. One criticism that we've already seen from MLA Kieran Testart is that it leaves out non-Indigenous Northerners,
right,
and also the removal of the priority status for Indigenous Northerners, which he calls, quote, a slap in the face to reconciliation. So what do you make of those concerns?
So there's two different cohorts there, right? So, and I actually want to start, well, it's either one. Let's start with Indigenous Northerners and the idea of, because we're now expanding the definition of an Indigenous person, rather than aligning it to peoples who are connected to groups exclusively within the Northwest Territories and very specific groups within the Northwest Territories. There's a big group of people that are left out. All Indigenous Canadians who don't happen to have that connection here, and yet you may be a Gwich'in person from Old Crow, you do not qualify. N.W.T, Inuit person does not qualify. So when we did a lot of engagement over the last couple of years, this is a group of people living in the North, often born in the North, who have actually reached out and said, this doesn't apply to me. I have no priority status. I don't have a P1 or the initial priority status. So, aligning ourselves with colonial borders isn't something that we think we want to do. We don't need to do. We want to be representative. We want to have a workforce that is representative, that brings on people who have more of an Indigenous worldview, perspective, values. Some of those folks may come from across the N.W.T border, but they're hopefully going to bring that perspective to the public service if they choose to apply. So I don't expect that there's a lineup at the border of folks coming north, although we'll certainly be happy to have more people coming north. I do expect this is an opportunity for us to truly look at what Indigenous Canadians, who they are, how they're defined, and hopefully bring them into the public service. The second cohort of people, and this policy, 1989, 35 years, never changed. It's hard to change things, and I think people can get scared of what that might mean and how that might work. So the cohorts right now, the second group, long-term Northerners, I think, has a notion that this is a protected group, but it's very specific. It's if you're born in the North or you've lived more than half your life in the North. So quite a lot of people who are long-term Northerners do not qualify under that. And people who might have been born in the North and moved away, but actually do qualify under that. So there's some odd results that can arise, and we're not necessarily reflecting people who are committed to the North, who are living in the North, who have knowledge of the North, who have connections to community. There's other ways to go about understanding job recruitment that will still tie to the communities of the North. So for example, one of them might be within a job description or job qualifications, prioritizing Northern knowledge, specific community knowledge, language knowledge, doing regional based, saying you have to be based within a certain boundary around a particular community or within a certain region. So there's a lot of other tools that we can use that are actually more targeted, that will get at the roots of the kind of qualifications we want to be able to serving people in particular regions, rather than a policy that, again, can often result in excluding sometimes people that we want, and yet including others who may not have the kind of knowledge that we're trying to get at.
Okay, Minister, I want to ask one more quick question before we wrap up.
Sure.
And this is about support from other MLAs kind of more broadly. We heard today on our CBC afternoon show that on the N.W.T. that Julian Morse, who's the chair of the Standing Committee on Government Operations, is not supporting this. He says the committee is not supporting this specifically. And Kieran Testart also mentioned there were some other MLAs that feel like they're not going to be supporting this. So I just wonder if that lines up with the conversations that you've been having with MLAs.
So, and I have actually spoken to a couple of the MLAs myself, including the chair of the standing committee. So there's different committees that we would go to. Finance goes to the committee that's chaired by Mr. Morse. And he and I had a good conversation about how we can move forward. This is a policy of cabinet, so it's not a piece of legislation, but we do want to maintain our engagements with all MLAs. So we had been to committee, the Department of Finance and myself, back in April, and again in August, sent quite a bit of background information. I think there's still some uncertainty, specifically around the groups that you mentioned, around ensuring, that Northerners, long-term Northerners, have access to positions. So again, with a 1% unemployment rate, I'm not concerned that people aren't being hired. Our student program and internship program continues to apply to students who have spent a year in the North before going off to school, so they'll still get that priority access. And then these tools that we have around ensuring employment that is relevant to communities that can target those skill sets. There's probably a lot in there that, when I spoke to the chair, that we can sit down and say, look, we can work through these things, make sure that people's communities understand what's available to them, make sure that these tools are being utilized to continue to reflect those communities and the people there. And I'm confident we can get to a place where at the end of the day, we're hiring a representative public service, which I think is something that we all share a goal of.
Okay, Minister, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.